I have the good fortune this morning to introduce Dr. Maria Pellegrini. And I have the good fortune, not just because of her pedigree, her experience, and her intellect, but because she's fresh off the boat from her adventure in Antarctica, 2 weeks in Antarctica. So we're so pleased to have her here today, and we're so pleased it's not as chilly as it was there. Maria is the executive director of programs at the W.M. Keck Foundation in Los Angeles, and she has also served in a similar capacity to me as the vice president for research at Brandeis University and the program director for science and engineering and liberal arts at the Keck Foundation. Prior to joining the foundation, she was a faculty member at the University of Southern California for 20 years as a professor in biology, and while at USC, she served as the department chair, the dean of research in the College of Letters, Arts, and Sciences, and was named a fellow in the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation. She is also the recipient of the Camille and Henry Dreyfus Foundation Teacher Scholar Award. Dr. Pellegrini is a chemist trained originally at Connecticut College, followed by her PhD in the same field from Columbia. It's my great honor to welcome her, Dr. Pellegrini.
Thanks very much. Again, thank yous all around to the university and RCSA, and also the Science Philanthropy Alliance. All of you here, I know, are very happy that this day happened. I was very interested actually last night to learn exactly how it came about, and it obviously was initiated by the university, which I congratulate you for. Throughout my various parts of my career, going from academia into the foundation world, back into academia again, I don't know why I felt nostalgic for it, but I did, and but it was a lot of fun, and then now again back in the foundation world, and throughout this tenure of these different careers, if you will, there was a constant admiration for the RCSA and what that foundation has been able to do. It's not got the biggest endowment, but I think it certainly has a very, very far-reaching influence. And my first in-depth interaction with RCSA turned out to be in a project that happened at the very end of the 1990s and early 2000s. It was called Academic Excellence. And that was started out as a survey of 136 primarily undergraduate institutions, and public, private, big, small, looking at how they were teaching, especially the physical, but also the biosciences, and what role that research played in excellence at these institutions. And as it turns out, it played an enormous role. And I think that study, again, called Academic Excellence, was really instrumental in helping to, for many of these undergraduate institutions to really spend a lot of time and energy on fostering research at these institutions. And that's not easy. If any of you tried to just do research on a small budget and with just undergraduate students, it's tough. But it happens, and lots of places are showing increased interest in that happening, and thanks to RCSA who supports that kind of thing. It certainly framed a lot of my own thinking when I got to the Keck Foundation about what we should do in our undergraduate program, and that was, again, fostering research. So that was my beginning. Of course, then Scialog came along from RCSA, and more than one application to the Keck Foundation over the years since Scialog began has presented teams of scientists when involved in a particular project that they'd like Keck to fund. And when we asked them, well, how did you all get together? They said, Scialog. That's how we found each other. So that was another experience. And last but hardly least, the fact that RCSA was one of the founding members of the Science Philanthropy Alliance, which is now, I believe, 5 years old. And the fact that this group, the Science Philanthropy Alliance, is in the process of offering to philanthropists who would like to fund basic research, both models and mechanisms, and also the possibility of learning from other philanthropists how this can be accomplished. And so I congratulate RCSA for having the forethought to be one of those founding members. But I will say that I can't really get away from RCSA, even in my own neighborhood. I happen to live in a little town called South Pasadena, which is not terribly far either from the USC Medical School or, of course, from Caltech. And so I go to the RCSA website just to get, up to speed. And on the front page of the website, what do I see but Sarah Reisman, who is the newest recipient of the Fred Award, I believe is what it's called. Sarah turns out to be my neighbor. I'm out walking, she's out jogging. I run into her kids at the local elementary school. And okay, so I can't even just go home and not run into RCSA. Likewise, Bob Grubbs, who I guess is a Nobel laureate in chemistry, but also an early recipient of an RCSA grant. He lives around the other corner. Anyway, can't get away from you guys. You're just reminding me all the time. But I will say that it's also caused me to reflect not a little bit on what the Keck Foundation has done over the years in terms of both trying to foster early career scientists and also just those wild and crazy ideas, as we call them. We shouldn't call them crazy, but sometimes actually they kind of are. One story that I love to tell about the Keck Foundation funding comes from about 2003, 2004, when we got an application from a guy named Jeff Gordon from Washington University in St. Louis. And he said, I am absolutely sure that all these microorganisms inside our gut are really affecting human health. And then he showed us the reviews he got from the NIH panels, from the study sections, and they said, we're not going to fund this. There's absolutely no evidence that what was then beginning to be called the microbiome has anything to do with human health. Now, today, if you tried to say that, they'd laugh you out of the room. But in 2003, that's exactly what they were saying. And happily, the board of the Keck Foundation was willing to take a chance that this guy might actually be right. In fact, it took 3 to 4 years after Keck made that grant for the NIH to even see on its radar the microbiome. Now, of course, there's hundreds of millions of dollars going into the study of that, and every single one of the national institutes of health now funds in the area. So again, it's one more example of the fact that private science philanthropy can take chances, and they can have a long time horizon too. Sometimes, science just doesn't come to fruition in the next quarter or the next year or even the next decade. And so that's one really, really important thing. And I think we'll see that later today in some of the faculty talks, how sometimes a very long time horizon is exactly what's needed to get important science going. One other thing that's, I think, really important, and again, I'll give a Keck Foundation example, is that science philanthropy funding, private funding, is flexible. In the 1980s, the Hereditary Disease Foundation, and in particular Nancy Wexler, who was at the time looking for the gene for Huntington's disease, and in the 80s, it was an incredibly laborious process to try to find a gene. And one of the ways in which they were looking for this gene was to find a family, which turned out to be related individuals who lived on stilt houses in Lake Maracaibo in Venezuela. And in order to get to these folks, they needed canoes. And as it turns out, NIH, which was funding a great deal of the research that Nancy and the Hereditary Disease Foundation was planning to do, was they had all the wherewithal, except they couldn't get there because NIH refused to fund the canoes that they needed. And as it turns out, happily, The Keck Foundation didn't care. They can spend the money on canoes. That was just fine. So the flexibility of the money, as well as the risk-taking aspects that are so important, I think, in private science philanthropy. For a while, about 12 years, the Keck Foundation also funded early career scientists in the biomedical arena. I'm happy to say that several of those folks now have taken leadership positions. The one closest to home is a woman named Kelsey Martin, who's now the dean of the UCLA School of Medicine. So again, funding those early career scientists can really make a difference. Again, often decades later, in Kelsey's case, it's almost 2 decades later, but she's done a marvelous job both in research and in academic administration. So with those things, though, said, giving this keynote address has also made me think about my own early career experiences. And thinking back on it, there's some really fun things that happened. And I think many of you will relate to this at whatever stage of your career you are at the moment. The first one was, I think, that many people have, which is what I call the imposter syndrome, or that many people call it that. And that is to say that somebody offered me a faculty job, and I thought, did they really mean it? Are they sure it was me that they were, talking about? And the answer is yes. In my case, it was at the University of Southern California. And being a football fan, I kind of liked that too. I know there's been scandals, but nonetheless, I'm still a football fan. College football, because it's just, you never know what's going to happen. So first it was, really, you really want me? You're going to hire me? Okay, I accept. And I will say that the senior colleagues in the biology department, even though I was a chemist by training, they hired me in the biology department, which was fine most of the time. However, especially when I became department chair of biological sciences at USC, people expected me to know the genus and the family and whatnot of all these organisms. And I asked me the periodic table, guys, that I know. But, are you crazy? I don't know this other stuff. But fortunately, I managed to skate through anyway. The next thing, of course, that happened that was really quite wonderful is there was a graduate student that really wanted to work on my science, the science that I was excited about. And here was this young man. I'm still in touch with him. His name is Steve Fabianski, a nice kid, son of Polish immigrants in Chicago. He was experienced at various construction jobs, which is what his family business was. And when I couldn't afford like a little change in plumbing in the lab, Steve would come in on a weekend with a buddy and we'd get the new plumbing. So it was, of course, crazy making for everybody else at the university, because when physical plant found out what we'd done, they were very, very unhappy with us. But it was too late. Anyway, but Steve did one thing for me that was quite amazing. And this is, again, an anecdote about how helpful many people can be in your early career. You know that when you're an assistant professor, all of the scientific instrumentation representatives want to come talk to you about buying one of their instruments. And there was a time when Steve and I were the only people in the lab, and I was taking time points really, really very quickly, in an experiment that I've been working at least a week on. And of course, one of these salesmen shows up at the door of the lab and says, "Dr. Pellegrini here?" And Steve looked at me and could see that I was panicked, because if I was distracted at all, I was going to lose a week's worth of work. And that was just, agonizing at that point in your career. So Steve looked up, and being the quick thinker that he was then and still is, he looked around and said, "Nope, he's not here." And the science, instrument rep looked around, saw Steve, saw me, and left. So So thank you, Steve. Actually, he wrote me right after Christmas and announced that he's finally no longer a CEO. He started a couple of very successful plant biotechnology companies in Canada, sold the last one very recently, and in fact, I have reconnected with him because he's come to Los Angeles a couple of times because his biotech company was a seed company, which the oil from the seed, it's sort of distantly related, I think, to canola. But this was the plant that he developed, and it's very good for biofuels. So both Qantas and United Airlines have made a big deal out of the fact that half of the fuel they use on very long distance flights from Los Angeles to Australia are the biofuel that Steve developed. So again, it's paying it forward. Another anecdote that I love to tell has to do with another colleague of mine. Now, you have to remember, for those of you under a certain age, there was a time without email, and you actually relied on something in an envelope with a stamp on it to get information. And we had, a common mailbox in our building, and I was really anxious and looking for an invitation to a scientific meeting that I wanted to present my work at, but it wasn't coming. And of course, at the mailboxes, there's also a little pile for things that they don't know where to put them into which mailbox. And there was a very interesting envelope. Unfortunately, it had nothing else on the outside of it to identify it, but it was addressed to someone named Narua Okegrubu. And so nobody knew what to do with it, and it was sitting there. And then one of my other colleagues, thank you, Hiroaki Shizoya, said, "Oh, Maria, that's you." And I go, "What do you mean that's me?" He goes, think about the keyboard. If you take your right hand and you move it over one key and you type Maria Pellegrini, you're going to get Narua Okegrubu. And I thought, awesome, that's me. I opened it up and it was the invitation I was waiting for. So thank you also. So you get help in many ways sometimes, unexpected ways, when you're an assistant professor. But most importantly, a favorite of mine, Karl Popper, who was the Austrian-born but British 20th century philosopher and historian of science, was wont to say, and this is a terrible paraphrase probably, knowledge proceeds from a series of conjectures and refutations. And certainly I had a lot of conjectures at that time and a lot of energy too, and I really wanted to try out lots of my ideas that had been developed over my many years of training. And that was great. I even had a graduate student and then shortly thereafter a postdoc who wanted to join my lab, but how to pay for it. There certainly was a reasonable amount of money that came in my startup package, but nonetheless, I still needed more funding. And as Dr. Brown said, I was lucky to get both the Sloan Foundation and Dreyfus funding, early career funding, at that time of my career, and that made all the difference in the world. So what about the role then of these many foundations? Actually, there aren't that many that fund basic science. There's only a few. As I think I've alluded to, they're willing to take risks, and they're able to take risks. They don't have to report to Congress next quarter or even next year. They can be flexible. They can buy a canoe if that's what you really need to get the work done. I will say that another organization that the Keck Foundation is part of, that's I think really both important and telling, is something called the Health Research Alliance. It's got nearly 80 members, and these are all private foundations. Many of them raise money. Some of them have endowments as well. But what they have in common is they all fund health-related research. And what is telling about this group is not only the total amount of money that they've given away over the last several years, and that's in the billions of dollars, by the way. And some of these are almost, these little mom and pop places, they're almost all disease specific. Muscular dystrophy, diabetes, cancer, heart disease, many, many of these. And what they have in common, and this is the vast majority of the 80 members, are that they fund early career scientists. That's what is a very, very strong thread through all of these organizations, because I think they all realize that in order to get the kind of science, basic science done, and in many cases translational and even clinical science done, is by funding early career folks, because they then are hope that these organizations then hope that these scientists will continue to do research that they so desperately need in different diseases. So I thought that was sort of a telling part of what the Health Research Alliance does. And finally, I want to say that, of course, there's never enough. And that's where I turn to the Science Philanthropy Alliance and their interest in providing information, models, and mechanisms for how to have other newer philanthropists, or philanthropists who've been established for a while who want to then come into funding basic research, to offer them ways to do it and to perhaps give them partners as well. So as a result, I want to actually invite everyone here, and I know not everyone is here yet because I think some of the speakers have yet to show up, but to think about your own, whatever stage of career you're at, to think about your own early career stories and maybe share them later in the day or throughout the day. But now, I think to the most exciting part of the day, which is something that I think all of us who do science philanthropy love the best, and that is hearing about those early exciting conjectures that folks had, or these some very early career folks, some later on in their careers, and whatever happened to those exciting early conjectures, and what came of it all. So we're interested in seeing that very soon. Thank you.